imagination through conversation and really dive deeper into the issues that are difficult to talk about so that we can build this skill set of having productive conversations around civics and long-term thinking and, issues that are multi-years in the future and that we haven't really made progress on. We need to focus on these areas. And our panel here is actively doing this. And it's just so inspiring. And I want us all to learn together and really just have a forum. So feel free to get involved throughout. Feel free to raise your hand. And I kind of just want to start us off with a question. So if there's a word that you can think of to describe the current housing system in Greater Boston, what would you say? And I think I'm going to toss it out to the panel here as a quick, before we even do introductions, just to get us in a mindset on what does our current housing system look like?
Expensive.
Hot ass mess.
Choppy.
Challenging.
Is there any other words from the audience that we haven't hit on that you guys want to say? One of the words that I kind of came up with, or not necessarily came up with, but heard was this kind of like financial extraction going on. And that really stuck with me of like, we're really prioritizing profit over people, and we need to work to do better at that. So just kind of to set the paradigm of the show here, we want to have a respectful conversation, really grounded in values, open-mindedness, experimentation, ideation. So, we want to also lead with empathy in our conversation. So just to kind of set the values of our foundation here. I also want to thank CIC and Venture Café, who are partners in our mission to fix the world through innovation. I also want to thank Sam from Black Line Strategies, also a CIC member who connected a lot of our panel here, and I'm just really grateful for him. So Sam, tuning in live, thank you very much. And just for all of you joining. I mean, you are here, you are actively making a difference by participating in this forum, so thank you. So I kind of just want to start us off with Burhan here. He has been working on abundant housing MA for the past 5 years and has really made it a focal point and earned the right to be a Cambridge City Councilor, which is amazing as a civic leader. Could you dive into this mindset that urban centers used to be a center for affordable housing? What's happened?
Yeah, it's a great question, right? So I think, in two different ways. Like, I know for a lot of young people in particular, it's hard to imagine, cities as ever being really affordable, right? You think of like Boston, New York, San Francisco. And it's just, a first thing as we talk about housing and how we could fix the system is to know that not that long ago were cities kind of affordable, right? Like, there's a reason that, if you go back way back to 1850s and stuff, like when people were escaping potato famines and stuff, people would go to Boston in triple deckers and that sort of environment. And that's how we got a lot of, our Irish immigration to lots of other places. There's a reason that immigrants kind of go to cities, and it's because historically they've had a lot of affordable housing options. It's really something new and opposite in some ways that in the last 30, 50 years, cities have kind of progressively become more and more expensive. And that's a whole bunch of reasons that I think that we'll all get to. But I think it's just important to know how recent the phenomena is. If you want the most stark example, pull up a Zillow page and just choose a house and then just look at its history. And you're like, wow, back in 1980, this house was actually not that expensive. It's pretty recent phenomena. And, I think part of my pitch is that it's kind of due to policy reasons. And that is, a policy decision that we've made and something that is also in that way reversible and solvable.
I completely agree. Policy is a huge reason why our systems are the way they are. And, I kind of want to lead in with Kimberly here for a sec, because I think her story about housing security and what the Dorchester Bay Economic Development Corporation is doing is really powerful. And I think that'll help ground our conversation here.
Yeah, so to your point, Burhan, I grew up in Roxbury, the Roxbury neighborhood in Boston, in the 80s and 90s, and it was affordable because that's where the poor Black people had to live, largely because of racist housing policy. And so now, fast forward to present day, it's a place where people like me are having a hard time finding affordable housing. And I think when I think about the work that we do at Dorchester Bay to develop housing for people who need affordability, who cannot live in luxury housing, it reminds me of being a kid who was born to a poor mother who needed a place to house her children and raise a family. And so this moment that we're in is really making it untenable for people like my mother, for people like me to be able to remain in a city, in an area that has been their home for a very long time.
Thank you, Kimberly. For Tom, you've been trusted by governors, mayors, boards. You're founder of an amazing development organization that is impacting Boston everywhere in such a great way. Can you talk us through the mindset of the difficult projects that you don't shy away from? You know, the 20-year mindset to build affordable housing. What goes into that for you?
So, first of all, thanks very much for having me. Really happy to be part of this panel. And this is a huge issue. And I do agree that there is a very specific set of policy issues that have put us in this position where we've arrived at. And there are some very important conversations that we need to have, you know, tonight being one of them. For me, you know, part of what I love about this is I grew up in a household in which being actively involved in our cities and towns, our home, this is my hometown. I grew up, you know, in Greater Boston. And so being part of kind of leading a civic effort, a great civic effort, is kind of something that my mother and father really wanted us to be part of. The one thing, though, I would add, though, just to kind of be less direct from your question is, for me, I would kind of update some of the policy pieces to suggest the following. And maybe this is part of my role to be kind of the more senior, older guy, I guess, here, but just to remember a couple of things. There was a pretty robust federal housing agency that existed in the United States until the early 1980s. And beginning with the Reagan administration, the federal government basically got out of the business of building new housing. So, you know, there's basically been no new public housing created. There certainly is still existing public housing, but for many cities like Cambridge and Boston and those of us, we're sort of on our own to care for that housing, to upgrade that housing, to rebuild it. And fortunately for Boston and Cambridge, the market is strong, so you can sort of work off the increment of that increased value to redo that housing, some of which has been done, as you know, in Roxbury and throughout Greater Boston, some of which has been done here in Cambridge. But the other piece I would just add is through housing policy, we just simply haven't added enough supply of housing. Honestly, it's as simple as a math problem in some respects. If you just look at, if you took the math and said, I'm not going to get these numbers exactly right, but these are approximately what they are. If you took the last 10 years, the Greater Boston region inside of Route 128 or inside of the Route 95 belt added something like 185,000 new jobs. Pretty good for, you know, for a region that grows at about 3 or 4% per year. But at the same time, we only added about 90,000 new units of housing. And most of those units were built in the city of Boston, and most of them were expensive because it's expensive to build housing. And I'm happy to do that. We can do this later in the thing, but it's expensive to build housing. And very few of those units were added in places outside of Boston. Boston carried more than its share of the weight in that. And so, you know, the math, as I said, is pretty simple. If you don't add supply, the cost of it, the price of it is going to go way up. So that's the key thing.
Thank you so much. I completely agree. There's a dramatic shift in the 1980s from a federal policy perspective. And down the road in this panel, I kind of want to ask, you know, what would federal policy look like to you?
Who's going to win elections first?
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I completely agree. One step at a time. But, you know, the 20-year mindset is important. So it's thank you. And, you know, Beth, you know, from the Kendall Square Association perspective, you know, how important is it to link economic factors with housing for the development of our beautiful community here?
So thank you for having me. And for those who may not have read the list of who's here, I just dropped my data. My name is Beth O'Neill Maloney, and I am here from the Kendall Square Association, as you mentioned. And you might wonder, you know, Kendall Square is full of labs and MIT and a lot of interesting tech companies. So what do we care about housing? And when I first took the job a little over a year and a half ago, I thought, well, at least I won't have to dive into housing. But guess what? I do. And how many people here are actively involved in housing for work? Okay. And the rest of you just care about housing because you see it as an issue. Well, so at the Kendall Square Association, it's become really apparent to me very quickly that housing is critical. Housing is essential to life. I mean, people need shelter. It's that simple. And this community is an incredible community, and it's really unique in how purpose-driven it is. People here are curing cancer. People here are ethically applying AI to all kinds of industries. People are working on tough tech. They're solving climate challenges. And we really think it's important to both grow, attract, and retain the people. We can't do that if you look at the math that we just heard from Tom as to the number of units. We need people to stay here. They can't stay here if they can't earn enough to pay the rent or to, God forbid, buy a condominium or housing. So Kendall Square really does care about housing, and that's, you know, why I'm here. I've made a pretty deep study of what we can do, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but I want to say thank you for inviting us, because I think this community has an outsized influence on the Massachusetts economy, and we have good relationships with the state, and we're doing everything we can to drive the supply of housing up. So thank you.
Thank you. So I think what to really ground us here, let's from a storytelling perspective, maybe discuss a little bit about the projects you're all working on with regards to affordable housing, and so that our audience can kind of visualize and understand, like, hey, these things are happening, and where can they lend their energy as well?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I guess I'll start with taking a step back. Anyone in the room know what Cambridge's population is? You know, take a guess. Yeah, 120,000, right? And US population? Yeah, it's somewhere around there, you know, 340. 1950, US population. Take a guess. 150. All right, so a little bit less than half. Cambridge's population, 1950. Yeah, you got it. It's about the same, right? And I think that's an important, you know, place to start with, right? There was a lot that went on in that middle of 75 years, and we can talk about that if it comes up. But like a different way to think about it is that, like, in almost every other country in the world, cities tend to grow over time, right? Like you look at a city in 1950 and you look at it now, and the population of that country went up, and probably that city's population went up. And uniquely in America's most expensive places, that is not true, right? Like Boston used to be 800,000 people, is now 700,000. Cambridge used to be 120,000 people, is now 120,000. Somerville used to be 120,000 people, is now 80,000. Now there's many reasons for that, right? There was a big suburbanization push and all those sorts of things. But also part of the reason has to do with zoning and supply, right? Like if you look at older pictures of Central Square, there were tons of taller buildings there that would not be legal to build today. In fact, if you walk around Cambridge, about 85% of the buildings that you're looking at could not be built today. If a meteor hit them, you would not be able to rebuild it the same way that it looks right now. And I think that's really important conversation to start with, right? The way that I think about policy is that there's three kind of big buckets that housing policy fits into. The first is supply, which I think we'll spend a lot of time in today. The second is stabilization, right? Like how do you keep someone who's already renting kind of in their own house and provide assurances there? And then subsidy, how do you provide, you know, what the government's really good at is like providing money either for people to kind of like do the things that we want them to do, whether that's renters or people who are trying to build housing or all those sorts of other things. But I think that supply kind of has to be the first thing you talk about, because, you know, if you think about it, it's like a water shortage, right? If there was 100 people, but only enough water for 90 people, it doesn't really matter how much more affordable you're trying to make that water. The fact is that 10 people are not going to have water at the end of the day. And so you really kind of have to think about the supply problem. And I think about, you know, in that 1950, forget all the people wanting to move here and all that sorts of stuff. All the kids that were born of those people in the 1950s, they physically could not stay here if they wanted to, because we physically did not have a house for them to live in. And I think that's a really, like, you know, we'll get into really abstract, complicated things about like demand and like, whether people want to live here and what the economics of it all look like. But like fundamentally, it's, remember, we're talking about something really real, and the core foundation of what we're working off of is pretty simple.
I think let's flow with this thought process for a sec, because I think let's stick with the mindset and we can come back to the projects in a sec. So I kind of want to build on that with Kimberly, because I feel like you were helping with the cooperative fund for the Northeast. And, I feel like our audience would appreciate learning about your takeaways from collective ownership. And again, how a different way of thinking about housing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the idea of collective housing and collective ownership of housing is not new to when I think about Boston and greater Boston, and whether we're talking about Irish communities, Italian communities, African American communities coming up from the South, whoever the communities are, this idea of we all need to put in together so we can have a roof over our heads is normal. And it is the thing that we do, right? To make sure that we're going to be able to sustain ourselves. And so I think that we have clearly gotten very far away from ideas of familial living, of cooperative living and ownership. And we have absolutely prioritized the bottom line, the economic bottom line. How much money can we extract from housing, right? And that to me is the antithesis of having growing cities, of having cities that have the kind of cultural diversity the greater Boston area has. And so when we prioritize who can pay the most for this home, we're losing a lot by not prioritizing how do we as families, as communities, own this land, own these homes so that we can ensure our own stability.
I think that's a perfect progression into kind of like what it takes to actually build affordable housing. And I think Tom has a lot of expertise on that. What are the factors that go into it, but also what are some of the factors that maybe our community isn't necessarily thinking about with regards to building affordable housing?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Can I just pick up on one quick thing
Please
Kimberly,
do.
that you were saying, which is, I think it's important to reflect on the fact that housing and the ownership of housing has formed a major part of individual households' wealth formation in the United States, certainly in the years after World War II. And I think it's really important to acknowledge, Kimberly, that that the United States of America discriminated in a very overt fashion against communities of color, and very specifically through the Veterans Administration processes around mortgages, through specific redlining, through lending, through bank loaning, and so I would just acknowledge, Kimberly, for me, I grew up, my family was in Scituate, and my parents bought their first house for $9,000, in Scituate in 1960, and that formed the basis of their household wealth, quite frankly. My parents are regular folks, and but the value of that house that they were able to write up formed their foundation. That was not available to communities to families of color beginning after World War II. It started maybe with enforcement in the 80s, maybe, but by then the values had really ramped up, right? So I think that's a really important thing for us all to acknowledge. But to get to the question though, which is the creation, how to create housing. So it's if I could, I'm going to be a little different than maybe some of the themes that you've hit. So to create a large multifamily project. So if you look at a 300 unit multifamily project, you would be surprised at actually how small the relative returns are, particularly for many of you who work here at CIC and think about, the kinds of returns that are often earned under, new life science entities or new technology entities or whatever that is. Typically, until the beginning of 2023, for about 10 years, if you had a project that could underwrite to a rate of return, just a straight up rate of return of 5.5%, not a big rate of return, then you had a buildable project. You could raise the equity, you could borrow the money, you could build that project. And that was based upon whatever the area rents would be, whatever all those pieces would be. And it was hard to build, but it became something that could get done. And a lot of those, as I said earlier, were built in Boston. What's happened in the last year and a half is, as interest rates have gone up, it's not simply a matter of materials becoming more expensive and the cost of building being more expensive. Now the return expectations of the equity has gone up. So now, whereas you used to be able to be able to have an equity investor involved. If you were at a 5.5% return, you have to at least be at about a 6.5% return, which, moves everything up in terms of the needle. So that means to build just a straight, what we would call a wood frame. So if you look at a 6-story, 300 unit project that you see most often built in the greater Boston area, that's what we would call, 5 over 1. So it's 5 stories of wood frame over a concrete podium, right? So first floor parking, concrete podium, 5 stories of wood frame, above it. To build that for us at Suffolk Downs, we're the owners of Suffolk Downs, and we've permitted 10,000 units of housing. It's the largest site for the construction of housing in the history of Massachusetts, privately owned site. So we want to move through 10,000 units of housing in a very, as quick a manner as possible, in a very, predictable manner, like building widgets. You got to build these units and be in a position to be able to buy 10,000 windows, 10,000 light fixtures, all those different things. To do that, the cost of each unit today is probably $700,000 to $750,000 per unit to build it today. So that's what drives what the rents are. That's what drives, and as I say, the profit actually isn't that big. The typical investors in these projects, these large projects, are union pension funds or life insurance companies, or it's the largest real estate investor on the planet is the retirement fund account for retired employees, state employees in California. By far, they're their largest real estate entity, investor on the world. So these are not, it's hard to make these projects work, I guess is the point. So I'm happy to come back to it, and I know I later in a bunch.
I think that was great. I mean, I feel like Suffolk Downs is, a great project to just like follow up with real quick. What aren't people thinking about when it comes to developing that in terms of affordable housing? You could even lean into the sustainability aspect of it, but I think for a project that big, we have to learn from that. And, what are some of your learning lessons early on? You mentioned, the bulk buys, but like, what other learning lessons are you, quickly absorbing and working through that you think it would be important for our audience to know with regards to affordable housing?
So there's 2 aspects to when you say affordable housing, there's 2 aspects to think about affordable housing. One aspect is there affordable housing that is built with what we would call government subsidy. So, and there's a bunch of different buckets of government subsidies. A lot of it, Kimberly, you guys are probably really familiar with. The most frequently used is the low-income housing tax credit. So, for corporations that are profitable, they can reduce the amount of their taxes by purchasing low-income housing tax credits from developers. The issue is for a state, you can only issue so many amounts of these, which are based upon your state population. Mm-hmm. So, it's a limited resource to be able to build it. And so you can only build X number of units per year based upon low-income housing tax credits. Again, coming back to the fact that the federal government sort of get out of the production of housing. The rest of it is Massachusetts actually is a pretty sophisticated, compared to other states, has a very sophisticated affordable housing sort of expertise network. Kimberly's part of this. The group of people, we're a net exporter of talent when it comes to developing affordable housing. There's a lot of really talented people here, but even that, the resources are few. The city of Cambridge has some resources. The city of Boston has some resources. So you'll see in any given year, there's a ribbon cutting for 20 units here, 75 units there, 100 units. But we're talking about, as the councilor said, there's a gap of thousands of units. Those numbers I just said to you, over the last 10 years, that's a 50-year gap. So, that same ratio has been happening for 50 years. So one aspect of affordable housing is we are underfunding public resources to actually create affordable units for people who earn, call it 65% of the area median income. So, or even 75% that's teachers, firefighters, municipal employees. That's a huge piece that we need to solve. The other part of affordable housing is cities like Cambridge and Boston have enough demand for the construction of housing, and the price of housing allows cities to say, hey, listen, we should impose on you the fact that you need to build X% of your units to be affordable as compared to the remaining units to be, to be market rate. Between Cambridge and Boston, that's probably been the largest producer of affordable units in the last 10, 15 years. It didn't really happen previous to 15 years ago. And in the reality, I'm sorry to be the historian for 1 second, the city of Boston didn't build a unit of housing for probably 20 to 25 years of any scale until the first one we broke ground on was in 1997. I was the BRA director then. And there really hadn't been much, but since then the city's built quite a bit. Cambridge really hasn't built much in the last couple of years just because a lot of different factors. But Cambridge had built a lot in the, I would say, 90s and early 2000s. So generally, the creation of that group of affordable units, though, is based upon the success of the private financing market. And as we just said, the private financing market, in particular in the last 24 months, has become really, really tough. So there's been very little production in terms of new affordable units in the last, call it 24 months. So sorry, I know that's a long answer.
That was very powerful. I'm very grateful for it. Going to Beth, just kind of building on what Tom was talking about the different careers of humans that we want to be in our city and want to feel like they're empowered and they're welcomed. For maybe, some people in the audience here, early career opportunities, why is it so important for Cambridge and Kendall Square to make these people feel welcome and, just make sure that it's affordable for them to stay, especially after, going through all the great institutions we have in our city?
No, that's a great question. And it's part of the reason I've spent a bunch of time learning what Tom just explained. And I hope that made sense to everyone in the room. The issue of financing, yeah, we need to call Jerome Powell and say, hey, can you adjust those interest rates down a little bit? That would make a difference. But essentially, this community, like I said, is incredibly unique, and anyone who works here or near here, and I say Kendall Square particularly, but really greater Boston, there's incredible things happening here. The commitment that we've shown to developing therapies for rare diseases, for developing the vaccines for the global pandemic. The way people collaborate here in the interest of science is really, really special. And what I'm seeing now that's super exciting, and some of you may be familiar, is the integration of AI and machine learning into life sciences, which is only speeding the science further. Well, that science only happens when we have people applying the AI or getting their postdoc, getting their graduate degrees and then working as postdocs at some of the incredible research institutions here, like the Broad Institute, like the Whitehead Institute, the Koch Center for Integrative Cancer Treatment or Cancer Research, the Reagan Institute, places like Mass General Brigham, now I'm still learning to say the name. So we need people to come in and to stay here. But the numbers are not working right now. Those of you who still read the Globe, I read it in paper form. You probably read it digitally. But if you,
the panel reads it.
but if you don't, it's worth going to the Boston Globe and just searching housing, because they've done an incredible series that really goes into the issues surrounding housing. Some on the finance side, like Tom explained, some on the human elements, some on the impact of some of the policies that Burhan talked about. A great deal on the MBTA Communities Act, which I'm a huge fan of. It's actually not an onerous law. But out-migration from Massachusetts is real, and I'm very, very concerned about out-migration in the future. So I looked up some of the data. So like I said, I had dropped it earlier. And this is the most concerning part. People aged 25 to 44 left Massachusetts at a greater rate than they came in, and at a greater rate than people 45 to 64 and people at 65 plus. So in the 2021-2022 time period, 23,000 people in that 25 to 44 age group left to Massachusetts. More. That's the gap between the number of people that left versus came and stayed. At 45 to 64 is just 10K, and 65 plus, it's only 5K. So they're not all moving to Florida, Arizona, or wherever else. A lot of people are staying here. I've even heard it referred to as the silver tsunami. And my hair might look like Tom's, but I have a good hairdresser. So these are real issues and something we're all concerned about at all ages. I bought my house in 1996, so it costs a lot more than $9,000, but it's worth a lot more today. That's not true of the young early career professionals that work in my office or that work at any of those amazing research institutions that I referred to earlier. So what hope do they have to be able to find a livable place that they is also commutable? The underinvestment in housing development is only paralleled by our underinvestment in transit. These are issues that we are very focused on at the Kendall Square Association. The scariest number I saw was from the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce did a survey. I didn't analyze the survey results, but I would like to, because what they found was 1 in 4 young people in Greater Boston, aged 20 to 30, plan to leave the Boston area in 5 years. So that's 1 in 4 in the next 5 years in the 20 to 30 age group plan to leave. That can't happen if we want this community, Kendall Square, and the larger life science, I saw it referred to as a super cluster the other day. But our life science and our tech communities, tough tech, climate tech, all of it, really need all of you and your friends and your colleagues and your children to stay. And we need to attract people and keep them here. So that's why I care, and that's why we've been learning about it. And we're trying to make sure that the folks who run those research institutions and the large companies that are headquartered here also understand and get behind the kind of policies that will make a difference.
Thank you,
Can I
Beth.
just add to
Please do.
some of that? I think it was yesterday I was reading in the Globe that they reported that the median home price now in the greater Boston area is $900,000. And excuse me, but what the fuck is that? Right? I mean, like, if it's not, if half of the homes are greater than $900,000, what does that mean for anybody? What does it even mean for people who make really great money, that you're going to be sitting in that house and cooking every meal because you're never going out to dinner? Like, it's a quality of life issue that this is the state that we're at. So I just had to go on that little tangent there.
I'm grateful for it. I have 2 things. One, Miles Howard wrote that 25% leaving style study. So that was, I verify that he's in a great place with that. There's a quote here that I thought was pretty powerful to kind of set the baseline for maybe a little bit of policy deeper dive, because we have a great worker on it right now. But housing is a fundamental human right. It is not only the foundation for other core rights, including health, education, water, sanitation, freedom of association, and freedom of expression, but also for the right to life itself and the right to live with dignity. And I want to credit Maz Kodo and Farah in 2023 for that beautiful kind of summary of how important housing is to our livelihoods and our right to self-actualization. How can we better ourselves without having a predictable roof over our heads that we can afford? So I'm just, again, so grateful that Burhan is working on this as a Cambridge City Councilor, and I kind of want to tee it up for you to kind of talk about the innovative policies that you think are really going to make an impact.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that we kind of get, what I like to say is that, as a politician, I'm like really dumb, right? Like, there's lots of policy experts out there that give me all sorts of complicated reasons why things are happening or they're not happening. And I look at like very simple things and I'm like, okay, well, that seems possible, right? So, before 12 years ago, we didn't really see much affordable housing development in Cambridge, right? And everyone was like, the finances don't work. There's a whole bunch of other sorts of reasons. People would come to us and get all these exceptions and like it wouldn't work, but like they can get the exceptions. And, one of the things that we did during that time is that we started a couple of different changes, but one of the more notable changes was this thing called the Affordable Housing Overlay, which is basically if you're building a 4-story building in a neighborhood up to 15 in our highest, densest squares, you don't have to go through the whole like permitting process that much. You get, you have to follow the rules, build to standard, but no one can really just like pick apart your project for no good reason. I guess as a prefix to this, the way that I thought that laws worked before I became a city councilor was that you would pass laws, and as soon as you follow the laws, you can do the thing that the law said. But in housing, it's not exactly like that, where it's like the law says it, but then at that point, you start a process. And during that process, a lot of different people can kind of still stop the project, even though you're following the law. And we got rid of that arbitrary thing and made it by right is like the term that we went with. And over those years, the amount of affordable housing development in Cambridge really did skyrocket. Okay, we've seen 1,200 units in the last 10 years built, a lot through our inclusionary program, but also a lot that were just built by the city and our affordable housing nonprofits. And I think that it really really values like the value of having clear laws about here's what you can and cannot do, and just being able to make that process streamlined. And also underneath that, legalizing housing. Like a big part of the reason we weren't getting affordable housing before, and the projects I'm talking about now were like 100% affordable, were because we didn't really legalize them. We kind of said there was maybe an exception process that you could maybe get with a year or two approval. But you know what would happen is someone would propose a project and then they'd get sued. And then they'd get tied up in litigation when they own the land, but they're not collecting rents on it. They're not, having workers who are getting paid for it. They're going through design. There's nebulous outcomes. And all of those would add expenses, such that once we started having a streamlined by right process, you could easily save a couple $100,000 per on the construction of the units. And I think that my goal is to kind of have like very simple rules that kind of say, like, what are the things that we care most about? Climate friendliness, having open space, and having more housing, and having those simple rules in place, but then just kind of going away with like the arbitrariness of it and having a streamlined process where if you follow the rules, you can build it and you can get your permit almost immediately. And I think that, I have a pretty big piece of legislation that's coming up on May 8th, which I can't fully share with you guys now, but I think it'll be pretty transformative to how we handle housing in Cambridge. And I think hopefully it'll lead to a couple thousand affordable units and hopefully, 10,000 market rate units being built in Cambridge.
That's amazing.
He's in.
Tom is in.
Streamline the process. You have a question there, Tom?
Yeah, Neil.
I have a supply question. Tom, you talked about winning elections. I'm thinking about actually like new city council elections where they go out, people don't want to build housing. So my question is, how much of the problem can you solve to address the supply issue? And then does it really come down to hearts and minds? How do we change hearts and minds in places like Newton, where we're quote unquote progressive, but we don't walk the talk. We shut the door behind us. How do we do that? Well, I guess how much of an is there proposed outside of Boston to actually move the needle on this? And then how do we change the hearts and minds?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of this this kind of work in communities like Newton and across the eastern half of the Commonwealth, and it's really hard to do. You're right. And now I think just to kind of update everybody, in Massachusetts, actually under the previous governor, a law was passed that said if you're a community that is serviced by the MBTA, there's kind of two levels of the service. If you have train service, then you're kind of a higher level of obligation. If you just receive bus service, then there's a more moderate level of obligation. But you have an obligation to create zoning in your community to allow for the creation of housing. And the idea is that would be part market rate and part affordable units. And so Milton, just as an example, Milton has the red line extension runs right through. I don't know if people are familiar. If you get to Ashmont Station on the red line and you go to take a train to Milton, you're actually going to Mattapan Square. So if you go to take the train from Ashmont, the sign actually says high speed trolley. Now if you get on this trolley, right, it's not it ain't a high speed trolley, right? It's a 1950s trolley at best, maybe 1940s. But the interesting thing, just to kind of do a little detail on this, Milton over time basically turned its back on Mattapan, right? So through zoning and restriction of parking and the rest of it, they basically ended up with single family zoning, single family homes against the red line. So then when they were left with the MBTA, I think there's an element, like in any town, there's X percent of people who want to do the right thing and be leaders. There's another percent of people who don't. It's like our country. Like we're hopefully we're 55% blue and but there's about 40-45% that's reddish, right? So in the town, I think people tried to comply with the zoning requirement of the MBTA's Act, but that meant that they had to rezone East Milton Square, which is not on the red line. So that the heart of that controversy is the detail of where's the housing going to go, right to your point. So at the end of the day, part of it's zoning, part of it's the law, but a big part of it is the hearts and minds of people, right? And maybe part of the hearts and minds are what's the right thing. Don't close the door behind you, as you say. But even more importantly, I think there's an economic imperative, right? I mean, if you're the we're the parents of college age to 20s kids, they can't afford to buy a house without our help somehow, right? I mean, they can't do it. So there's an economic imperative for all of us to do this. We all have to do the right thing to make this happen. We're in a crisis, as a region, and we have to build these units. Really, really important to do. So.
I would like to add to that, because I hear this question a lot, and I will tell you, as a Bostonian, it feels so unfair that we have had to carry the burden of dealing with this housing crisis. And the fact is, the wealthier, whiter communities that benefit from the many great things Boston has to offer, you all participate in the theater district. Somebody has to work at those theaters, right? Like, everybody else needs to do their part. And it can't be on us to just keep on having the density piled on top of us. And I actually don't care so much about people's hearts. I want you to think about your own interests. There's safety interests that you have if people cannot find housing, right? Because guess what? They're coming out to where you're living and all kinds of things. There are the economic interests. If we have a region and if we have a state where the people who service the restaurants you participate, that you go in and have your meals in, and all of these other things cannot, for the teachers, the firefighters, the police, all of these people that you need to feel safe and comfortable in your communities, they need to have an affordable roof over their heads. And it can no longer be the responsibility of the largest city in New England to carry that burden alone. And so what I would say is, I hope you are going to your neighborhood association meetings. I hope everybody in this room and everybody on their live stream is doing that. And that when affordable housing or zoning changes and all these things are being proposed, that you're in favor of them, because it actually benefits you when there is more housing for people to be able to make a life in.
I'm going to take that question from a slightly different perspective. And I think you might have a question as well. We can add both in. All right. So I am also the founder of Abundant Housing Massachusetts. I'm on the board now. And we, have, as an organization, have had boots on the ground, and most of the communities that have had to pass the MBTA communities, legislation, which required, all these communities to build housing. And so I'll start with the positive aspect first, since I think we covered a lot of the obligations, right? Which is like, in Newton, for example, there was this ugly election, the pro-housing city councilors got voted out and all of that. At no point in that conversation was it ever a possibility to not comply with MBTA communities. Like, that was not part of the conversation. The conversation was like, okay, fair enough. Yeah, that was not a realistic outcome of the election. I think even the city councilors that lost, the pro-housing majority that lost, I think that the city councilors that are still in power will comply with the MBTA Communities Act. And I think that the city councilors that got voted out wanted to go above and beyond and do extra. And I think that in Milton, where we had a big loss, right, it was still, I might have the numbers slightly off, but I think it was 46% voted to comply with MBTA communities and 54 voted to not. And that was after, the local, I forgot, town meeting voted to approve the legislation. It was really a ballot petition after that, they repealed. And so we won the town meeting, and then we were pretty dang close in the final ballot vote too, right? And it was on Valentine's Day and all these sorts of complications. And then this completely overlooks the fact that in a lot of other communities where, they're not always the most pro-housing, like, Brookline and like further out and all those sorts of places, a lot of communities just complied with the law, right? So I think that we focused a lot on the negative aspects, but like the vast majority of communities, took this state mandate and really have complied with it. And we're going to now see what the attorney general and how the conversation in Milton goes in particular. But I'm actually not completely negative about the MBTA Communities Act and people kind of voluntarily complying for most of it. But I think that also what's kind of negative about it is that I'm not actually sure the MBTA Communities Act is going to produce that much housing. I think that the real part is that we've downzoned our city so much that really the MBTA Communities Act is going to mostly kind of just legalize what's there and maybe a little bit of additional housing. But Somerville, for example, had to comply with the MBTA Communities Act and legalize triple deckers. And I don't know if you've seen Somerville, but there's already a lot of triple deckers. And now they're building 5 ADUs a year, right? So it's the numbers are not quite adding up right there. And I think that the way that I think about it is, I think that housing can be a winner electorally. Last term, Cambridge is kind of more similar to Boston than maybe Newton, but I last term had a bill that was 15 stories in the squares, and I got the most votes out of any councilor who wasn't the mayor. And so there's some truth to that. But I think the bigger thing is that locally, it's all about housing, right? When you think about your local council, that ends up being a big voting point. But a lot of the benefits of housing are about everything else. It's about economic vitality. It's about the fact that our new housing will be ADA accessible. It'll be climate friendly, especially compared to old housing, right? There's all of these sorts of ancillary benefits that you don't really judge a local councilor on how your local economy is going. And I think that's why all the people who've been really successful or all the other states that have been really successful at passing zoning reform have done it at the state level, right? That's what California's done. That's what Oregon's done. That's what all these other places have done. And you see the difference between, local elected officials who can kind of get a little air handy and the governor, the attorney general are all housing is issue number 1, 2, and 3. And I think they really get it. And I think the incentives really align a lot more where people can kind of see the whole picture and not just the negatives of there's going to be construction on my street and I'm going to have new neighbors and more traffic, but also all the amazing benefits that you get. And, I think that it's hard in Massachusetts because of local control and all of that, but I'm really hoping that we can push a lot more of this conversation to the state level. And right now, the State House is looking at whether we legalize ADUs, and that's a bill going to the State House. So I'm kind of, it's a little bit on the knife's edge, but I'm kind of hoping that we can start making progress there.
I want to pass it down to Beth real quick. And while it's passing down, I'm kind of reminded of the story of Bill McKibben, who just wrote a great memoir about how this very same fight happened in the 1970s. And he was so optimistic, going into the 1980s about how we were going to build this better world together. And the housing, not in my backyard movement was successful. And that kind of led into the past few decades. So the yes in my backyard, we are stronger as a more diverse community is super important. And Tom has his website, we want to welcome people, having people feel welcomed here is so important. And Beth, I want to let you.
Yeah, and I know there's a question, but I just have a couple of quick things to say following up on some of my fellow panelists here. First of all, Burhan, he said he was stupid. He's an MIT grad, and you can tell from his passion and his knowledge and his thinking on this topic is really deep. So credit to you, Burhan. Kimberly, I think if we want to win hearts and minds, we need to bring the likes of Kimberly to some of our meetings in Newton and some of our other communities. And I agree with you. The MBTA Communities Act is a first step. And I think that the second step is the Affordable Homes Act, which the governor has pending up at the State House right now. And it includes, among a number of different provisions and more than $4 billion with a B dollars to address these housing issues. And yes, it'll go through I think it's on its 3rd committee already. It'll go through a lot of process, but I think we'll come out with something pretty good. It includes, to Kimberly's point, collective housing. It includes a provision about ADUs, which I'm a huge fan of because I am constantly looking at our competition, and California has ADUs and it's working. It also creates a potential for a collective environment. Your ADU could be someone unrelated to you. It could be your mother, your mother-in-law, whomever, someone that sort of helps you manage your household. There's 1,000,001 different uses for ADUs, but that's part of the solution. State surplus property disposition, that'll make an impact, and funding to municipalities for rezoning. That's a great opportunity because if you look at our zoning laws, some of them are embarrassing. Again, the Globe had an article about there were some deed restrictions that were flat out racist in some of the deeds, I think in the counties north of Boston. At any rate, I think the answer to this problem is not simple, but I do think the answer to this problem it can be summed up in one word. Anyone know what that is? It's density. We need greater density, whether it's an ADU, whether it's a 8, 9, 14-story building in a commercial section of a community like Cambridge, or 6, 8 stories in a commercial venue in Newton or in Brookline or wherever. People need to really think about, and Tom and I talked about this, who do we want to be? Who are we here in New England? Who are we here in Greater Boston? Are we completely insular, or are we welcoming, to pick up on Tom's point and his website? Like, we need to welcome people, because welcoming people to communities like this is how we're going to drive our economy, our innovation, the kind of collaboration that we need to fight the forces of climate action. So thank you all. And thanks for the chance to say all that.
I think that's a perfect segue to Tom for sustainability. Yes. This concept of innovation is so, we're in the Cambridge Innovation Center, and climate sustainability. I mean, ADUs, does everyone know what ADUs are out there? Accessory dwelling units. They're a quick way to kind of build houses. And, I saw the Globe's article that they're $200,000 cheaper at least to kind of put out there, which is a great way to manufacture at scale. So I guess, Tom, kind of following up on that is, from an environmental sustainability standpoint, what innovations are you seeing out there to make housing kind of like multi-purpose, but that's not necessarily the word I'm looking for, more so sustainable? How can we make housing more sustainable?
So ADU. So first of all, just quickly on the ADUs, I would try everything. Honestly, ADUs, zoning reform. We're in such a crisis right now. It's almost like throwing everything at the wall and seeing what sticks, right? So I'm for all of those different pieces to add supply. That's all important. We haven't really talked much about, climate change, which is such an overarching issue for all of us on all these different pieces. The one thing I would say, if I could, just from a development perspective, as we take on some of these larger projects, the thing that I most worry about is the grid. We basically, the new building, the first building that we're delivering at Suffolk Downs is 100% electric building. Now, in our industry, that's kind of a big deal. I know that may sound like not a, at this point in 2024, not that special, but for us, it's kind of a big deal. It's almost 500 units, 100% electric is a big deal. For us, it made sense in part because, first of all, we really want to be forward leading in terms of our new developments and where we want to be, but also too, it was a little bit cheaper for us to build it this way. It's a whole long story as to why it was, but it saved us not a huge amount of money, but it made it a little bit easier for us to build the building. So we like an all electric residential building. So going forward, our expectation would be all of the large residential buildings that we build will be all electric. But if you step back as an ordinary person, I went to this, the New England Council does a series of sessions. So last week or 2 weeks ago, they did a session where they had a number of different people from various utilities and, folks who represented the electric utility and sort of generating businesses of the Northeast. And the numbers that they kicked around in terms of improvements that were needed to the grid to match up with the expected demand as we move buildings like ours and all the other things that we're doing were numbers like, $10 billion to improve the grid, $24 billion to add more more power plants to the grid. How are we going to, honestly, as I look out, I don't think wind and solar is going to cut it for us in terms of the amount of power that we're going to need. What does that mean? Does that, if we don't have nuclear fusion yet, are we building nuclear power plants? What are we doing? So to me, that big question for us as a country is completely unaddressed. If this issue is an existential issue for us, we're not treating it like it's an existential issue from the power perspective. So from a housing and development perspective, we're on board. We're moving all our buildings to all electric. We're moving all our building. We haven't even talked about resiliency, which, for us at Suffolk Downs, we've had the ability, because we control the entire site, to do something that's totally different than the seaport. And by saying that, I mean we can build it with a diverse group of workers who reflect the diversity of the communities that we serve, from Boston to Revere to East Boston to all the rest of it. And we can make it a welcoming place for a diverse group of people from all the different communities that we serve. But as importantly, the other piece that we can do differently than the seaport, because of what we know now, we can engineer the entire site to make it resilient over time to coastal flooding and the right, which is what we've done. So it's actually an award-winning design from that perspective. That wasn't my fault. It was my idea. It was the professionals. We had great professionals on our team who really helped us engineer that entire thing. So we'll deliver a building, a set of buildings that will be resilient to coastal flooding and results of climate change for the next 100 years, which is great. But to me, the overriding question is, can we figure out the grid and the power needs that we're going to have as we move ourselves to that? That to me is the bigger issue.
Let's keep attracting the talent and keeping them here to solve that problem. Kimberly, we touched on this a little bit, but you mentioned this great line to me earlier that the housing crisis is the Commonwealth's crisis. And, I think we have to know what we're up against. So kind of like, I think a majority of humans, one of my theses, are actually on the same page with our values and what we want. But what is preventing the progress from getting there?
Yeah, I think there are so many things that prevent us from getting where we need to go, right? So first, Tom touched on some of the racist policies that helped to create many of these conditions, and that just made the development of different types of housing were hostile to the development of different types of housing. So part of what prevents us from getting there is understanding that, right? Understanding the foundation that we're sitting on, so that we can think about how to dismantle that and put some other things into place. But there are also other kinds of challenges. Like we have certainly in Boston, and you know this better than I do, Tom, like it's challenging as hell to develop housing. Like it's a very complicated process. And if you don't have all of this intense subject matter expertise, right? If the zoning doesn't change, it's really difficult to build housing. I will just give an example and say that, Dorchester Bay is an affordable housing developer. From the time we see a piece of land like, oh, okay, we might be able to do something there, to the point where human beings actually move in and it's their home, that's a 7-year time horizon, right? So when you think about the lack of supply and the lack of availability of affordable housing, it shouldn't take 7 years to get from an idea to human beings actually making a place their home. There is the issue of hearts and minds, where collectively people don't see developing more housing and more affordable housing as their issue. They see it as the issue of the poor people or the working class people who need that kind of housing, and not the comprehensive economic issue that it is for the state. So there isn't any one thing I could identify that's a barrier. It is multiple things, but they are all things that every person in this room and every person that's engaging in this conversation has some ability to influence and do something about.
Thank you. Cynthia online has asked this question to me, and I want to open up to the audience in a second. I just want to ask Burhan one more question. But, how do we solve this? And I think it's kind of like in forums like this that, and honestly, the reason why I started a video production company was to shift culture through videos, through media, because I feel like that is how we kind of win the hearts and minds is, people are on their phones all the time. Like we have to get the information out there. We kind of have to win this marketing battle, be like, these ideas, if we can talk about these ideas, if we can visualize them, we can do it. That's what humanity does, is we self-actualize things that that weren't possible decades ago. We look at this beautiful building we're in. Like we can create beautiful things together, and we have to really focus on it. And that's how I think we're going to move forward. So that's how I personally want to do it. I just wanted to address Cynthia's question. Thanks for tuning in, Cynthia. And I just kind of want to leave us with a little bit inspiration too of Burhan. You've mentioned some other cities and other places that are doing this well. Can you kind of show us that this is possible?
Yeah, that's a great point. I would say two things. The first is just on the political point. I think we talked about the benefits of housing, and I think they're really numerous. And like, it really is a place where I spend a lot of policy attention because it's the #1 most expensive thing for people, right? And so like, if you can move the needle on housing, it's kind of like makes so much space for everything else. But I would say that, the unsaid part of this is I think that, the part that's kind of squishy and hard is like, I think it's also kind of important for having a conversation about having people fall in love with cities again. Like, I think that, I don't know exactly what was in the water, in the 50s to the 80s, but it feels like, there was like a love for like suburbs and like cities as kind of like preserved in amber. And like, I'll just say like, I really love Cambridge and I love Cambridge Crossing, right? Like, it's high density, but it has a giant park in the middle of it. There's all sorts of fun events you can go to every day. Like, I can bike to work, but I can also walk to work. And every day I walk, I just like run into people that like I haven't talked to. They're not like my best friend that I'm going to necessarily talk to that day or that week, but like, it just like builds a lot of inherent community. And I think that like, it just makes it so much easier to accept housing and things when you're actually excited about having a new neighbor, because that means that a friend who's going to move away can stay, or they can move a little closer, or you just have someone new who could potentially be a friend, right? Like, it's like a really wonderful way to kind of like make it like, seem like the new housing is not this like scourge on the community, but it's actually kind of a benefit in of itself outside of all the other benefits you get, and I think that's really wonderful. And I think that in terms of the beneficial examples, I think California's ADU regulation has really been amazing. And in that they set like this standard for ADUs, which are smaller houses that go in the backyard that you can't really see from the street necessarily. And they started producing like 500,000 ADUs a year. Like, it's insane numbers. And I think that, we talked a lot about construction costs, from an engineering perspective. I think about like, how do you get those costs really low? And it's like, I began this conversation with like, cities are a really cheap place to live in. And it's like, everyone here who's actually does development like knows how hard it is. But also like, from my simple-minded brain perspective, I'm like, you walk on my street of like triple deckers and they're all kind of the same exact triple decker. And there was like a factory where they made this triple decker. And in the Sears catalog back in the day, you'd be like, I want that triple decker. I want to order it for $10, And like in California, that's exactly what's happening, is that they legalize the same ADU across the state, and you can just kind of put it in. So there's companies that will mass manufacture those ADUs, and you can just kind of put one in and plop it down. And I think having that level of standardization of saying like, this housing type is kind of legal all over the state, even if it's that our Cambridge triple decker again, like I think would really bring down construction costs and make it, an affordable way of people to live. And kind of just like legalizing that statewide would lead to a lot more affordable housing throughout the state. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I think it really makes Uberized travel much more like a great thing. That we can get rid of these huge parking lots around these buildings and change the zoning laws so that we can have a little more density. And yet the people moving in aren't considered the low life of the community because they don't have a car. So if we had more Ubers that came more often and people saw Ubers as better than having your own car, I think this would really help a lot, because it wouldn't be like, oh, they're poor because they live in that building. It would be like, this is cool.
Thank you for sharing. And I completely agree that the parking requirements are a huge way to bring down construction costs.
Got rid of them in Cambridge. So.
I did that last year.
The mundane issue of parking makes or breaks housing projects. I'm telling you, to the extent that you have to add one more level of below grade parking to make a project, sometimes it makes a project unbuildable. So it's a huge issue. Oh, sorry.
Oh, no worries. So we're coming to a close here. Is there any other questions from the audience? Okay. Let's go. Yes.
Who's waiting for a while?
Yes.
So to cover this question and a little bit of context, I
Here.
work for a homeless services organization in Cambridge, just up the road, actually on Broadway. And there's been a lot of like lovely discussion about housing and ways to make that keep people in housing. But I would love to know from your all's varying perspectives how we bring people into housing. And I'm thinking about the barriers such as the 5 to 7 year wait list for Section 8 vouchers, which flies in the face of communal living. How we can just get people back in a home where they can like reaffirm their dignity. Thank you.
Can I actually start with this, Council? And you may have a thought on this. So one other piece that I didn't really hit is, so if you were, for example, in Boston for a long time, to build a market rate project, you had X% of units that had to be affordable. So let's say let's say it's 17% today, which is what it is, right? So typically the way this works is when you deliver a building that is, say, 300 units and 17% of those units are affordable, just to give you a sense of the magnitude of the problem, it will take a period of time to fill up all 300 units, right? So if the market rate units, those, if you were to lease up a new building at approximately 20 market rate units a month, that you'd be doing pretty well. Maybe 25 would be pretty good. Okay. But with all the affordable units in Boston, the way this works, Cambridge is similar, but in Boston, the way this works is you typically use a third-party entity like a community development corporation. Deutsche Survey does this, I think. So you go to a CDC and you say, okay, I have 50 affordable units that are ready to be leased, and the CDC will pre-screen, so that they'll advertise across all the newspapers, local newspapers in the city of Boston, and they'll probably end up for 50 units. They'll probably end up with, I'm going to make a guess, but like 500 people, more, 1,000 people, 2,000 people, right? So they'll end up with like 2,000 people, okay? And from a developer perspective, the first units to fill up in every building and to pay rent, quite frankly, are those affordable units. It's a unbelievable thing to watch in terms of just how dire our housing issue is, I guess, to the point. So sorry, Councilman.
I think that was great. I'm gonna there's a lot in that question from how do you people who are homeless, how do you get them to paperwork and all those sorts of stuff. I'm gonna narrow down the question a little bit, which is people who make really low incomes, right? Let's say less than 50% of AMI to almost nothing. How do you get those people housing, right? And I would say that there's a couple different things. One is that all the zoning relief we're talking about now, we've been talking about program, but it really is for all types of housing. 116 Norfolk Street, which we're building in Cambridge, is supportive housing for people who are transitioning from homelessness. And that project would not have been allowed unless we made the zoning reforms for affordable housing for people making 50 to 100% AMI. But this project was also able to take advantage of that zoning reform. So it really is lock and key. And then the second is I think that when we have subsidized housing, a lot of people are going to sign up because who would not want to pay, less rent and all those sorts of things. But also actually, let me get to one point before I get to that. The second point is that the Cambridge Housing Authority, the way that we do vouchers is that we have a pool of money and we will subsidize people who are deeply affordable. Inclusionary is made for people who make about 50% of area median income. If you make less, you can't really live in this affordable housing because it's meant the rents are taxed at that level. Cambridge Housing Authority will give vouchers to people to subsidize them to that level. And so if we build more inclusionary units, more people who make a lot less money will also be able to qualify for it. And otherwise, this Cambridge Housing Authority, because we don't have those affordable units, will subsidize twice as much for this so they can live in a market rate unit, but then half as many people get those vouchers. And then finally, I would say the numbers we're talking about, 10,000, 15,000, it's overwhelming to think about. But I would also push it a little bit in the sense that we are a city in Cambridge, at least our current wait list is 15,000 people. Our guess is most of those people are not going to get a house in my lifetime by default, right? But I would push it to say that in a city of 120,000 people, adding 15,000 more doesn't seem that crazy, right? If we had the political will, we can easily build the housing for them, right? Cambridge, there's a joke inside Cambridge politics that we have more money than God, right? We have so much budget and all this financial capacity. It is really our willingness to have more housing in our neighborhood that is the limiting region. And I am very confident that and you'll see some of this on May 8th about building 15,000 new units in Cambridge or 20 to 30,000. I think is totally doable.
Let's go.
So what about co-housing? Come on, our woman she's divorced, she's got a couple kids, she goes to work, she has to go home by a certain time. If there are other people around, it could be good. Plus, it could be a lot cheaper to build a community like that rather than say, oh, you have to have a special separate unit for everybody.
I love that idea. I think the cooperative model is a very interesting economic building model. And the only reason why I want to just quickly rapid fire the questions here is because we were supposed to end 3 minutes ago. And I know that Venture Cafe is going to be, I just want to be respectful of their time. So let's just go. Can we just go right to left real quick with questions with the mic so that the online audience can hear? And let's try and be as pointed. And, our panelists I know are super well spoken, so we'll battle through it.
So, Councilor, you just mentioned about funding, about what the budget for the city is like. A couple touches on parking. If you put those things together, other than your own ability to influence things at the city level, what is the staffing? What is the funding like? Is there an outreach to people with innovative thinking like this officially between the city and CIC? Are there programs like that?
Yeah, I would just give one small example. I think this is a more detailed question, but in LA, they passed this thing called Executive Directive 1, which was like a special exemption for affordable housing from basically most zoning in LA. And that program, 100% affordable, you would think you would never make money on it because you're deeply subsidizing all these rents, right? Private developers were actually able to take advantage of this and make the numbers work because like the zoning was so great that they're building like 30, 40,000 units of housing in LA that it's become deeply unpopular because it is building so much affordable housing. And so that's just to say that I think that it is actually quite possible to get people who are not part of the government and other people to create creative financial models and even make money doing it. And like, it's definitely possible.
Last question. I know Alex is back there. I want to be respectful. Cool.
Bouncing off of Kimberly's suggestion of joining a civic association, I'm just wondering, are there in-person events or organizations you guys recommend in terms of social and civic engagement that we should be checking out? I mean, just an example, I just met Bill for the first time like a few days ago and he recommended me come here, so that's why I'm here.
Oh man, that's my last question anyways. That's a perfect way to go. Let's go down the line.
I'll just say, join Abundant Housing. We have events in every city.
I was just going to say join Abundant Housing. I was literally going to say that. And I was also going to say, don't underestimate your presence in your own neighborhood at your local civic associations. I can tell you, I go to these things a lot, and no shade to folks who are my elders, but it's mostly seniors who attend these meetings, and not necessarily, they do not often reflect the diversity of our neighborhoods in terms of age, in terms of housing need, in terms of like family size. So don't underestimate like the power of just showing up to your local neighborhood association and supporting different kinds of housing.
I'll add a perspective, so for Suffolk Downs to permit 10,000 units of housing took us 3 years, and I did 450 different public meetings. I actually like this engagement, so to do it. And I can't tell you, in a room, if you're in a room with 25 people who are against a project and one person stands up and says, you know what, I'm actually for this, it makes a huge difference, not only to the person who's presenting, but also to the elected officials who might be there and listening, or the people who are watching. I mean, it's a big deal. If you show up and you're for something, that's a really important thing. And I would encourage everybody to do it. Thanks. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, act locally, absolutely. And on the innovative ideas, if you have them, send them to Abundant Housing, or if it's Kendall related, you can reach out to me. I'm on our Kendall Square Association website, and maybe we should do a housing innovation session, and maybe we'll try that later this year. But I'd say get behind what the governor's doing. Take a look at the Affordable Homes Act and get behind the MBT Communities Act in your community.
Yes, I agree.
Is there, do we have time for one more question, Alex, or should we wrap? One last question. Bill, did I see your hand up?
It's more than a question. The reason we're all here is we share an interest in housing, real estate, and tech. And I haven't heard much conversation yet about what role the tech community might play in the housing solution. So I just came from the AI summit that MIT is hosting. And I would like to suggest we take a page from the YIMBY Town Conference, which is, this is a town that loves to innovate. We love unconferences. We love hackathons. I think we should start a Hack for Real Estate Good. The National Association of Realtors will be here in November for the second time in 6 years. Let's show them, Tom's point is that we are best practices leaders in the country, and let's prove it.
I agree.
Thank you, Bill.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I don't want to cut anyone off, but I feel like this is just a super successful panel discussion forum from my perspective. I'm so grateful for you all joining. I'm so grateful for let's just give a hand to our panelists, please. Like, they were amazing. And they've talked to me about it, but it's all about putting in the work. Like, what are you going to do about this? Like, we've learned from this, but what are we going to do next? We all have to show up. We all have to put in the time. Civics is not a spectator sport. We have to participate to build a better world. And I believe we can do. I know we can do it. So again, thank you all. Signing off to everyone online. Thank you for joining us, and hopefully you'll join our next forum. But for tonight, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's gonna be big.
It is gonna be big. It's gonna be huge.
I'm going to